Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Rose Tinted Ceilings podcast. Today we have with us a special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Avery Thatcher. I am from Alberta, Canada, and I specialize in helping people recover from burnout and prevent it from happening again.
Mm,
And I think this is something that is so much more prevalent now than it was even 5 years ago. So I'm really excited that we're talking about this.
That's really great. I've been wondering that too because the word burnout I've been seeing pretty regularly now, like people talking about it. But I feel like when I was younger, no one really used the term. So I'm wondering, like, is this like a new thing people like just discovered, or like what? How did it become super popular?
Yeah, great question. So, really, it depends on the generation you were born in for how it gets talked about. Because when we look back to like the boomers generation, they were really more focused on like loyalty to their job and like you tough it out. And if you can't hack it, then that's on you. But now we're in a much more mental well being focused group. So that is changing our perspective on it. And then also with the always connected technology, with the comparisonitis that we see on the internet and social media and all of the things, it changes the dynamic of how we interpret our stress. So yeah, it's a little bit of both. So it's kind of that we're just talking about it more, but a lot that society and our relationship to work value and productivity has changed.
You brought up
mm.
stress in there a bit. Would you say stress and burnout are like the same thing, different, related? Like, what's the relationship there?
That's a great question, too. So, stress is our body's natural response to anything different. And that's just how we always go. And our stress response was designed to see that dangerous thing go and then fight or flight our way to safety. But because of the way that society has evolved, we've also developed the freeze and fawn response to our stress switch. And so the difference is that originally our stress switch was designed for those quick dangers coming at us that we needed to get away from or get to safety with. But chronic stressors like we're facing in our lives now doesn't go away. The pressure to be as successful as possible, to get into a job that's meaningful for you, all of these things are just different kinds of pressures. And then also, like, this idea that everybody should try and own a house, but how are you supposed to afford that really in this economy, right? And so when we're going into that kind of view, the research shows that we actually move through three different stages of stress. So the first stage is the stage of alarm. That's the like moment. Then because our stressors don't go away, we go into the stage of resistance. And so this is where our body is able to keep up with the energy demand that our stress response has on us. Because our stress response requires a lot of energy. It's got all of the adrenaline hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine running around and doing all of the things. And so eventually the stressors pile on too much and we can't keep up with that energy demand. And that's when we move into that last stage, the stage of exhaustion, which is burnout. So when we talk about burnout, it's important to see it more as an energy management problem, not so much a stress management problem. So stress and burnout are related, but they are definitely not the same thing.
Okay, so I guess my question now is with all of these different stressors in our life, how can we learn to manage the stress and manage the energy as well?
Yes. So I like to explain this like in an analogy. So just imagine you're sitting in a boat and the boat is full of holes. But it's okay because you've got a bucket and a life jacket. So the bucket, you're going to slowly bail out that water and you're going to toss it off the side as the water's pouring in. But then eventually the water starts to come in too fast and then you're starting to get tired and you can't really bail it out as much. And that's when your life jacket catches you. So burnout is our life jacket. It's our body's safety mechanism that prevents us from failure. And the bucket are your coping mechanisms, those stress management strategies. And so when we're looking at how to actually prevent burnout, we have to look at the sources of stress, the holes in our boat that are allowing all of this extra pressure to come flowing in. And there's two different categories of those holes in your boat, those sources of stress. There's some that you can do something about. You can set boundaries around, you can create a plan for, you can time block or do all of the things. But there are some stressors that you can't do something about. the culture that you're living in, the society that you grew up in, the beliefs that you were taught as you were younger and as you're growing into them and figuring out what they look like for you. All of those things, we can't necessarily plug up those holes, but we can learn how to manage them. Because really, the boat and your bucket are able to find that balance, that stage of resistance balance, where we're able to recharge the energy that we have and the energy that we're requiring. And so that's where we kind of want to get back into, is that space. Because from there, then we can look at, okay, how can I plug or slow more of these holes in my boat?
I'm curious. So usually when I've been hearing the word burnout, I've been thinking of this like super negative emotion, like, oh, I'm like so burnt out right now. But the way you described it in your analogy, like as a life jacket, it seems more of like almost like a rest and recharge moment. So like how do you view burnout? Like is it that negative? Is it that positive? Like what's the balance there?
So, this is where I really like to see things not as positive or negative, but either serving or sabotaging, because then we don't have that preconceived perspective of what that word is associated with. And so when we look at burnout, it is just information. Burnout is that warning sign to say, like, hey, we can't keep up with this as it is. You need to change something. So when we think about burnout in that way, it gives us a much more empowering stance to stand on. And the other thing as well is that there are four different kinds of energy, and so there are four different kinds of burnout. And we can be in each of these different kinds in isolation. We could be in a combo or like a grand slam of all four. But learning to see burnout in that way can also be really helpful to being able to see burnout as information.
Hmm.
Hmm.
The knowledge is
Maybe could
power.
you walk us through some of the symptoms of burnout? How do we recognize that this is happening to us?
Yeah, great question too. So the more obvious signs that we can see, those ones are the physical exhaustion, where you kind of need to give yourself a pep talk to get out of your chair to go pee. When it's really hard to focus and you feel like your motivation is gone, that's also a really clear sign. One of the interesting things about our stress response and how burnout plays into that is when we're running away from something dangerous, digesting the cheeseburger which we had for lunch or contemplating the meaning of life is not a priority. We're focusing on survival. And that's because our body actually really looks to support us as best it can. And so that means that we're going to have some digestive problems because our body, when it's under stress or in burnout, it's not prioritizing digesting our food. It's prioritizing, the strong muscles in our body and the survival instincts in our brain. And so it's going to show up as indigestion, maybe bloating. This is where like ulcers can come in for extreme versions for some people, reflux, we kind of have heartburn. And then with our thinking side of our brain, again, because we're prioritizing survival, we struggle to make decisions. We struggle to do complex problem solving. It's hard to remember things that we're trying to learn because we actually kind of lose access to our prefrontal cortex, our higher level thinking brain. And so those are some of those more obvious symptoms of burnout. Now, some of the more subtle signs are that we'll withdraw socially. And even if you're a very introverted person like I am, and you're kind of like a homebody all the time, you still find that you don't reach out for connection. If you're around people, you don't really contribute to the conversation as much. Other signs that are a little bit bizarre is your pinky finger and ring finger side of your hand coming down into your arm. That can get numb or tingly. That's also a sign of burnout. Itchy soles of your feet can also be a sign of burnout, which is just so fascinating to me. I love how our body works like that. And if you're a bit more irritable than normal, like you say something and you're just like want to eat it right back because you're like, where did that come from? It felt like a monster saying that outside of you. So signs like that, those are some big things to start looking for.
That's so interesting. Like I can't believe the symptoms go from like getting ulcers to getting like tingly like
Yeah, like
feet
itchy
on your
feet.
hand.
Yeah,
That's
right.
crazy.
Yeah.
Is there a
And
reason
it's
for that? Is there a reason why this part of your hand just goes numb?
Yeah, so it's part of our nervous system and how it relates to our central nervous system, and just also where we're holding tension. Because when we are more stressed, we're more likely to kind of pull in towards our body, which just protects our vital organs. It's a survival mechanism again. And for a lot of us, that puts pressure right here in our elbow on the ulnar nerve. And so that'll make those fingers go numb.
Okay, that's really interesting. Um,
I thought so too. I'm a
yeah.
super nerd though, so you know.
The next question I have is, okay, let's say we have a person, they're like, okay, I have these symptoms. I recognize, oh shoot, I have burnout. What do they do? What's the first step now after that realization?
So because burnout is an energy management problem, with stress related factors, but we're still looking at it from the energy perspective. There's actually 3 stages that we need to go through to be able to fully recover from burnout. And the reason why is because most people think that burnout is like a cycle, like a circle, right? So you start at the top where you're feeling amazing and like your best self, and then you kind of everything piles on, it gets to be too much, and then you burn out and you're out of energy and you're just relaxing and trying to recharge down at the bottom, and then life slows down enough or you're forced to slow down enough and you start to feel better. And then people think you come back up to the top. But the truth is, burnout is actually like a wave, more like a ball bouncing down a hill. So you start up really high where you're feeling great, and then you come into burnout. And then you recover up a little bit, but you don't come fully all the way back up to the top, and then you burn out deeper. And then you come back up a little bit more, and then you burn out again. And this is where a lot of us start to reach out for help in burnout, is we're at that bottom where it feels like we're kind of just oscillating between feeling a little bit better before life kicks us down again. And so we're in that sort of wave form there. And when we're in those spaces, we have to first recover some of our energy. So that's step one. And because really, if you want to start to create some changes or start to do those stress management strategies that you know help for you, you have to want to. And when you have no energy, you don't want to. There's like no capacity for that. So step one is to recover your energy. Once you're there, then we're going to start to optimize your energy. And this is where we're looking at sleep and routines and habits and energy management, and then also like nutrition and things like that that we can work on. How can I best support my body's able to recharge? And then once you're finished through that, that's when we move on to the last stage, which is to elevate your energy. And this one's the one that you need more brain power for, which is why we save it for last. And this is where we look at the unhelpful beliefs, the patterns that we follow that lead to burnout, like perfectionism and people pleasing and overcommitting and all of the things that really push us as maybe high achievers to really end up in burnout quite a bit.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really insightful. Thank you for that. We get a few examples of what recovering energy might look like? Like, how do I go about like just recovering? Like, what's the process there?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we can do that's really easy is to do an energy check in. And so, what this looks like is we're looking at our 4 different kinds of energy that I talked a little bit about before. So, we have physical energy, mental energy, emotional energy, and fulfillment energy. And so physical energy is what we typically think of energy levels as. And that's where we either have energy to get up and do whatever we want during the day or we don't. And we wake up feeling like not restored at all. The mental energy is our ability to learn new things, make good decisions, think in abstract ways. And when we don't have that, we are forgetful, we struggle to focus and to concentrate, and it just feels like we're living in this fog. For emotional energy, this is where we have the ability to hold space for the people that are important to us and to really enjoy those sparkly moments in life. And when we don't have enough emotional energy, that's when we're complacent, when we're irritable, when we're just really short tempered, those kinds of things. And then the fulfillment energy is when we feel like what we're doing is making a difference. We can see the impact that we're having on our corner of the world. And that is going to show up in different ways. Like, you don't have to be in some kind of leadership space or, leading some kind of movement to pick up community garbage or something. It just needs to be, are you making a difference, and do you feel connected to that purpose? And so the reason why we need to check in with those, especially the first 3, the physical, mental, and emotional, is because some days we're going to be really low on one of those energy batteries, and it's important to adjust our day to match with that. So an example of that would be if I woke up in the morning and I had really low mental energy. For me as a business owner, I'm not going to try and code my website. I'm not going to try and deal with like complex things. I'm not going to start taking one of the courses which I'm working on. I'm going to pick up the lower hanging fruit. I'm going to do the easier things that are less mentally taxing for me. I'm also going to prioritize something which I know helps restore some of my mental energy. So by checking in with those things and just becoming more aware of your current energy, you're able to be more successful with what you actually have to give for the day.
Those are definitely such great tips. I think my follow-up question would be if we were to see somebody else struggling with stress or struggling with burnout, are there any tips or skills that we can apply from an outsider standpoint?
Yeah. So good question too. So I think one of the things that we have to realize is that before someone's ready to make change, they have to realize that they don't want to be where they are. So it's we are all so helpful people, and we really want to help people feel better. And it's a lot easier for us to just reach out and say like, "Oh, hey, have you tried this? Oh, hey, have you tried this? You should try deep breathing. You should try yoga." But that person also needs to realize that they don't want to feel the way that they do right now. So I think really the first step of trying to help support somebody that you think is going through a lot of stress and burnout is just to reach out and say, "Hey, it looks like life is really tough for you right now. I'm here for you." And we can even just sit and be together. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you're not going to have to figure this out on your own. We can do this together.
Do you think there, like, what are the reasons behind someone maybe not wanting to like recover from burnout? Like, are there like, is there any reasons why people might want to just be like, oh, I'm okay here, I'll just deal with it?
Yes. So there's actually a number of different reasons why. And so part of it is the way that our brains are programmed over time. So when we're growing up, our parents are teaching us, they're the caregivers in our life, are teaching us ways of being, ways of thinking, how we find value in our world. And more, as modern capitalism continues to evolve, we're moving into this space where our value is really tied into accomplishment, not the effort, but the outcome. And so when we look at stepping back or trying to recover from burnout, we see it as number one, we don't have the energy for it. So how am I supposed to do that if I've got to do all the rest of this? But also, it feels almost like failure because you couldn't figure it out. You're struggling where everybody else seems to always have it all together. And that's part of that comparisonitis kind of thing that we were talking about before. So that's one of the reasons. Also, because our body is programmed naturally. This is another design flaw, if you will. But we're programmed for something called negativity bias. And so this means that we will fixate on things that aren't working rather than remember the things that are, or fixate on things that are potentially harmful to us rather than really focus on those things that are beneficial. And this is truly a survival mechanism because back in our nomadic days when we were living off the land, we had to like watch out for dangerous things in the forest. And so we had to recognize, ooh, that sound means a bear or something big or whatever it was. And so we're just wired to start to focus on that. And so then when we're in this burnout space, anything that's different than what we know is going to be scary. It's going to be dangerous, and our body's going to see it that way. So then our stress response activates, which makes it harder for us to access our prefrontal cortex, and it drains our energy even more. But then also our inner critic, that voice in our head, the doubt dragon and the self-talk, is going to run around and push all of the panic buttons to be like, this is different. Go back to the way things were. We knew what that looked like. It sucked, but we knew what that looked like. Let's go back there. So our body is wired against change. And so somebody that's dealing with burnout, even the smallest shift can seem like a lot of effort and a lot of work. So their body will work against them. That's why they have to want it. So that way they can start to work with that side of their nervous system.
It's really interesting how our bodies are just not made to deal with this. That's actually really.
Yes, exactly. We just weren't designed for the world that we're living in and the stress that we're experiencing. And that's okay, but it just gives us, again, more information. We have to look back to times before this all started. And there's a really interesting thing. I remember seeing this on Instagram for like a decade, and they talk about like, if you're really struggling to do something, tell yourself it's not a priority for you and see how that feels. Like, have you heard that phrase? No? You guys are probably too young. That's probably it. But yeah, there's this thing where people are saying like, yeah, like if you know you should be working out or know you should be eating better and you don't really have time for it, just tell yourself it's not a priority and then see how that feels. And it drives me crazy because the word priority was only pluralized after the Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s and early 1900s. So when assembly lines and technology started coming in and all of those things came through, we started to have to multitask. We started to have to be responsible for more things. And so this is really shaped and completely taken off, because when you are looking to plan your day, I bet you're thinking of like, okay, what are my priorities for today? But the truth is that word priority, when we get down to like the super nerdy Latin roots, means first thing. So we only could have one first thing. So this is another piece of the puzzle that we have to like look at and just look at how our situations are evolving to make sure that we can continue to work with them and work with how our body is designed.
That's so interesting. I never knew about that. That's so cool.
Yeah, I'm a super nerd, like I said, so I love it.
So we talked a little about how our bodies aren't really like, they're not evolved a bit yet to keep up with this. I don't know if you know about this or if there's any like research backing it, but are we like leaning towards being able to handle this? Like, are our bodies starting to learn? Like, is there any changes going on that would maybe help us deal with burnout more, or is that still a few centuries away?
No, it's definitely happening. And that's where, when they were originally looking at stress, it was back in the 1960s. And interestingly enough, and a lot of the stress research at the time there was funded by tobacco companies to prove that cigarettes were helpful for managing stress. So when we look back to that time, the stress response really was just designed for that stage of alarm. But then when we moved more into the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, that's where they started to see those different stages. And we can see over time that our bodies are evolving, that the one hormone that we have that's also linked with stress is called cortisol. It gets a really bad reputation in the media and online. People talk about how it's terrible for you and all of the things, but I like to see it as a superhero, because it's evolved to really run around your body and get all of your cells to tell the brain, hey, we're hungry. We're really hungry down here, because it needs more energy, right? So then our brain is like, okay, cool. I'm going to crave the high carb, high fat foods with lots of cheese, lots of sweets, all of the things. And the cortisol is really there to help us. So when we look at the evolution of cortisol over time, it is supporting us in that way a little bit more. And then when we look at how food is manufactured and how we can ease into that part and to be able to support our body's energy in different ways. So I think both physiologically we're evolving, but then I think also external to ourselves, we're finding ways to evolve and adapt. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about humanity, is that even though things, especially right now, may not be going the way that we would hope they'd be going, with the world being the dumpster fire that it is, we're going to be able to figure it out. We'll figure it out.
That's so sweet. Now I feel really bad for cortisol because it gets such a bad reputation. I feel like on
It
social
really
media, I'm always seeing,
does.
like, how to
Yeah.
lower your cortisol. Like, signs you have high cortisol. And it's like, oh, okay. Well, now I feel bad for it.
Yeah, totally. And the thing is our cortisol is natural in our body. It is meant to be there. It's what wakes us up in the morning. It's just the normal wake up caffeine coffee kick. And our cortisol flow usually peaks sort of around 6 to 8 in the morning, and that's kind of what wakes us up. And then it starts to fall during the day, and then our melatonin that helps us sleep picks up later. The problem with cortisol, if there's too much of it running around telling all the cells to tell our brain that we're hungry, then it doesn't come down quite as low. And so it's so much closer to the wake me up threshold. So when it starts its natural flow to come back up, it wakes us up a lot earlier. So generally, if you're in that more pre-burnout or burnout phase, you'll wake up about 3:30 or 4 in the morning and struggle to sleep after that, because that's when that cortisol starts to wake us up again.
Oh, that's really interesting.
I love it when I learn something. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
And so now you know why you wake up at 3:30 in the morning.
We were taking a look at like some of the materials you had on your website, and we also noticed that the term trauma was there quite a bit too. Could you talk a little about how that is related to burnout, or if
Yeah.
it's related at all?
Oh, it definitely is. Definitely. So trauma is different than stress or distressing experiences, because trauma is actually an injury to your nervous system. So it's like breaking a bone. And so that means that we have to know how to heal that part of our nerve system to be able to prevent it from acting. And so when we have trauma, true trauma, this is where some of the stress management strategies won't work for us. And in fact, they can actually be very harmful. So, for example, I do have some trauma. I've worked as an ICU nurse, and I don't think you can go through that without getting some degree of PTSD. And I also have other experiences as well growing up and whatnot. But I had a big flare up of it. And I was sitting down to meditate because usually meditation is a safe space for me. And I was just sitting down, everything was feeling fine. And then all of a sudden, I was outside walking my dog. I was 20 minutes away from the house. I had no idea how I got there. I was glad that I was wearing a jacket, the dog was on a leash, and I knew where I was so I could get me home. And so that the reason why that happened, that dissociation happened, was because we have two different alarm levels for our stress response. Usually when we talk about stress, we think about the hyper vigilant one. And this is the one where we generally go into fight or flight. And that's where we feel activated. We feel that stress response and we feel like we're in danger. But then also when we down-regulate our nervous system too much, which is what can happen in cases of trauma, it also triggers that stress response. And instead of activating, it kind of shuts down. And that's where we can dissociate, where we can numb out, where we can tolerate things that normally we wouldn't. And so when we look at burnout through the context of trauma, there are a lot more patterns that we have to be very conscious of, because when we have trauma, we're more likely to do either the freeze or fawn response. And that means that when we experience things that are stressful, we either feel like we can't do anything about it and we just feel very stuck and very much like that victim. Or when we're in the fawn response, this is when our people pleaser kicks into overdrive and we're just like, okay, are you okay? Are you okay? I'm going to make sure that you're okay. Everything's going to be okay here. And you like put out all of the fires around you, which of course uses more energy as well. So really in the context of trauma and burnout, you want to make sure that if you're really looking to recover from burnout and you want to work with somebody to do that, that they understand the implications of trauma before they just say, oh, you need to meditate more and practice yoga, because that could actually be very harmful for you.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks for letting us know that. When you mentioned like looking for someone to work through that with you, what would that consist of? Like, what would it look like finding someone to help you work through your burnout, to help you work through your trauma? Like, what are the kind of steps you would take from there?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things is that you need to connect to the person. Because if you're going to be sharing information about your life, you want to be able to share that with a person that you won't feel judged by. And it doesn't matter if they have their PhD or if they're a social worker or if they're like a former registered nurse or whatever it is. You want to be able to connect with them because you have to feel safe. And so that's the first thing. And then the next thing is just to make sure that they fully understand your circumstances. Because again, if you have either complex trauma or PTSD kind of trauma, you want to make sure that they know how to not re-injure your nervous system, because there are a lot of people out there that are coaches, and there are some great coaches, don't get me wrong, but there are some people out there that are sharing what worked for them without the full knowledge of how that would be very harmful to somebody else. So I think being aware of those two things is really important. And then also, it's so important to meet yourself where you're at. And I think whoever said this ages ago, that you need to have 30 minutes of self-care a day, like I would love to shake them and just be like, why did you put out that number? Because for so many of us, a solid 30 minutes is not possible. Like that's really hard to find. And so instead we want to look for pockets of time that we can do some of our stress management and burnout recovery strategies within. Because, 60 seconds before you walk into a building, you could do a couple of deep breathing exercises for that. You could do really simple shifts in your nutrition that could help support some of your energy. You could, instead of going to an hour or 90-minute yoga class, you could sign up for a virtual one that's 15 minutes. And you can look for those little bits of time where you can find things to help. And when you're looking to work with someone, you want to make sure that they're not also expecting you to meet with them for an hour, do 3 hours of homework and everything in between sessions, and you're doing that every week. Like, there's a number of things to consider depending on which phase of burnout you're in.
That helps so much. I think definitely sometimes we see handling burnout as like this big thing that is unreachable. We have to do too much. It takes too much energy. But seeing it as small little pockets, I think that definitely helps make it look more manageable.
Absolutely. And you know, you're not alone in that. Almost everyone that I talk to, they're just like, it feels too much to recover from burnout. And that's why we talk about it in those three phases, right? You've got to recover enough energy that you're now able to start doing some of those things to optimize your energy or to elevate your energy. And so, really looking to recover has to be the first step. And so that's where, like, we have an app that's called Creating Calm, and it gives you 60-second meditations, quick journal prompt exercises you can type right in your phone. And there's 15-minute yoga classes. There's a 2-minute little intention every day that you can then start to work on some of those things. It's all about the small shifts, because again, like we talked about, if you do too many big changes at once, your body's just like, well, that's new, I don't like that. And then your inner critic is just like, everything's not okay. So we want to make sure that we're working with the nervous system that's really struggling when we're in burnout.
Mhm. For sure. We know, like, definitely, like, from the past, like, 20 minutes, that's a lot of new information that I've never even heard of to begin with. I'm sure that's the same for our audience, too. Is there any way you wanna, like, any, like, overarching thoughts about everything we've talked about?
Sure. Yeah. So if you only get one thing from this, I'd love it to be this. Always do your best doesn't mean always be perfect, because your best is going to change moment to moment, day to day. You're going to have different capacity, different energy capacity. And so if you have 30% to give when you wake up in the morning and you give 30%, that was your best. And that's great. So always do your best doesn't mean always be perfect.
Hmm.
I
Yeah, that's
love that so
beautiful.
much.
I think all of us need to have that reminder regularly. Me too.
Maybe, like, put it on a wall somewhere. That would
Yes,
work.
I have magnets because I needed to have it in places.
And do you have any last things you want to shout out, like your app, social media, anything like that?
Sure. Yeah. So if you have any, like if you're feeling like you're in burnout or you're not sure, I do have a quiz that helps you assess your burnout risk. So you can go to becomingavery.com, and the free resources section is there. There are buckets of free resources that are all those quick little things, those pockets of time, self care activities that you can do to help you recover some of your energy. So you can find all of that at becomingavery.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at becomingavery. And I am getting onto TikTok, but please be patient with me because I'm old.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
I
so
gotta
glad.
rewatch this later to take notes.
Oh, I'm